It's lovely to see you all here, especially since it signifies that we all have this shared interest in metacognition. Just give me a moment and I'm going to share my screen. Right, okay.
Yes.
All right, sorry about that, we're off now. So here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to talk about metacognition in English teaching, and I'm going to talk about some of the reasons why we've been a bit slow in take-up. I mean, we're not vigorously teaching metacognition as I see it at the moment. And I think there are about 3 reasons for this. One is the way metacognition is being defined. Another one is to do with consciousness and awareness of language. And another one is to do with generalizability. How generalizable is that idea of metacognition that comes to us from cognitive psychology to English teaching? And from that, I'm going to derive a working definition to use in our teaching. And then I'm going to think about a few principles of teaching metacognition in our language lessons. I'm going to zoom in on a few current practices and discuss them. And also then I'm going to show some local research, or at least mention local research, that gives us some ideas about how maybe to move forward in a different way when we're teaching metacognition. And I'm going to end by really stressing that the teacher is of paramount importance in this process. So I'll start with a little repetition of what Poe said, in that metacognition has become much more visible recently, partly in Singapore because of its emphasis in the most recent 2020 syllabus. It's one of 3 focal areas: multiliteracies, metacognition, and inquiry through dialogue. And of course, it's also associated with the 21st century skills of self-regulation, adaptive thinking, and many more. There is a long-standing tradition of research in cognitive psychology, but I feel that it's been pushed back a little bit in transfer to English practice because of our turn to the social. And one example I can give is that in our department, in NIE, we haven't been able to mount courses in psycholinguistics for about 7 years now. So there is this dearth. The reasons for the dearth and the slow take-up are first to do with the way metacognition is defined. We have multiple definitions in multiple fields, and many terms are used synonymously, like higher order thinking or critical thinking, and so on. And there's also that very taken for granted mantra about metacognition being thinking about thinking. And this doesn't take us very far when we're considering practice. Another issue is that metacognition is often situated in problem solving. And problem solving is not necessarily the way that we arrange teaching and learning in English language lessons. Another reason for our slow take-up is the idea of consciousness. So in English, how do we think learning takes place? Is it a very effortful, self-conscious process, or is it one to do with immersion and engagement? That's the question. And another reason is the idea of domain specificity. We know that English has a specific structure of knowledge and specific ways of thinking and using language. And so, you know, maybe metacognition should too. Okay, so let me move to the first point, which is definitions of metacognition. And the very traditional, if you like, definition in cognitive psychology is the idea of a person's knowledge of self, tasks, strategies, and the control and monitoring and evaluation of those strategies in application. And that's the definition largely that our 2020 syllabus follows in their glossary. But even the definition in psychology has been expanded to include metacognitive experiences, which adds affective factors such as motivation, fear, mindsets even, about metacognition. Other important aspects, I think, that we should take into account is the idea that metacognition is necessary for transfer of learning. And obviously, transferring learning to a new context is one of the goals of education. We can think that there is transfer in a couple of ways. So one way is low level, the idea that if we learn through practice, drill, proceduralization, transfer will happen to similar contexts. But if we learn deeply by developing awareness, transfer to new, fresh contexts is likely to happen. Another point to note is that while many terms for thinking are used synonymously with metacognition, research in early childhood and a bit later schooling shows us that it is included in the construct of self-regulation, which we go back to those 21st century skills is one of those. And then the question of how metacognition develops has been shown to be through brain growth, just cognitive maturation, but it's also been shown that we can actually teach and guide metacognitive awareness, even to young children. So let me now move to the question of awareness. How does cognition become an object of reflection to be monitored and evaluated and so on? And the answer, in my view, is through verbalization. So to think about verbalization, I'm going to draw on Swain's theory from second language acquisition and the idea of output. The idea that in learning, learners notice, perhaps here an item of language or a way of thinking. They test out their own theories, their own hypotheses about how to use or receive that. They get feedback from the environment or from people, which results in the development of metalinguistic awareness. And now I'm moving to the term metalinguistic awareness, which I'm going to draw into metacognition later on. Another important idea is that in order to verbalize thinking and language, we need a meta-language called a meta-discourse. So we need another layer of language, a meta-discourse that operates at a higher level than language in use. So the meta-discourse, like it could include mental verbs like explain or compare. That meta-discourse allows us to talk about the language in use. So it distances us and works at that meta level. So it allows us to reflect on language and thinking. So now just moving on to the idea of domains and how generalizable that rather traditional theory of metacognition can be. And the argument for domain specificity is that the principles which structure knowledge in any discipline are different. And that means texts and tasks are different too. So in English, we don't structure our whole curriculum around problem solving. We include response and experiences. And even the construction of knowledge, the process of learning, is different among disciplines. And in English, it's viewed as socially situated and involves individual effort, self-consciousness, as well as engagement. And I'm going to expand that a little bit with, work from Vygotsky, whom I'm sure you're all familiar with. But just to remind you of that zone of proximal development, the idea of the use of dialogue, verbalization, discourse with a knowledgeable other, and the idea of the development from experience and everyday language, spontaneous concepts, to more complex, more abstract scientific concepts and language. And to add to Vygotsky, I want to draw your attention to Bloom. And this diagram shows you how, as thinking becomes more complex, so language needs to become more complex. And so thinking and language are intimately connected and should proceed in tandem until, you know, the highest level, when we get to that meta discourse. So we get to the most complex language in order to think about thinking and language. Bloom also suggests that this has to take place through the learner's agency and effort. So I arrive at metacognition in the subject English language. And we have the broad idea of metacognitive awareness from cognitive psychology. We also have the more specific idea of metalinguistic awareness from English language. So awareness of language. And we also have the idea of multilingual awareness, which is our awareness of languages and English in relation. So it really is awareness of the way we position English around other languages that we know. And these three can be worked into the definition for the subject English language. So here I have it. This is a working definition, and I'd like you to read it and to think about it as I put by the side the underpinning theory. Okay, is that all right? Poe, can you give me a thumbs up if it's okay? Yep. Okay. All right, so here's a, thank you. Here's a working definition that is drawn from the ideas that I've presented, which come from the reasons, the challenges in transferring metacognition wholesale from cognitive psychology to English language teaching. And obviously, if we're going to teach metacognition in our lessons, we need to know what it is. So a working definition at least will guide us for a while. Another guide are the principles developed from what I've been saying. So when we're thinking of teaching meta in English language lessons, we think of it as based on developmental cognitive psychological theories of metacognition, which prioritize deep learning over practice, drill, and proceduralized learning. We think of it as based on sociocultural theories of teaching and learning, which involve dialogue, discussion between teachers, pupils, and peers. We think of it as recognizing as very necessary children's learning of that meta discourse. So they have to have the language with which to talk about language and thinking. We also recognize a distinction between language immersion in use and the conscious application of meta abilities. And we also recognize that it is, in many ways, subject specific. Number 5 seems a bit of a repetition of number 4, but it's about children's effort. So it's about self-consciousness, effort, being agentive in learning versus being deeply immersed and engaged in joy of learning and language. And principle 6 recognizes that metacognitive knowledge and skills do develop gradually, but they can be guided and taught. Some children may come to us already with a degree of metacognitive knowledge, skills, etc., because of natural development or because of home experiences, but some will not. So we can expect diversity in this area just as we expect it in any other area of our English teaching. So now I'm just going to move to thoughts about current teaching practices. And these are four that I think I know I've tried, and in some ways, I found them doable, but in many ways also, I found difficulty in implementing some of these. So if I take strategy-based approaches, this means isolating a particular thinking strategy, pulling it out of a context, teaching it in a focus lesson, and then merging it back into a context. So for me, I can do it, but I find that getting that strategy back into context and keeping children's awareness of it is problematic. We do have frameworks and routines that we apply. We've got process writing, we've got reciprocal reading, quite a few frameworks and routines for focusing on cognition and therefore metacognition. My problem with this is that sometimes they become very routinized, and also sometimes they deal with very few of the cognitive skills. So you have to have a lot of frameworks and routines going. Annotation is, again, a way of making thinking and language visible. And I think it can be very effective. I also would think that sometimes it's a little bit directive, especially with lower primary children, not lower primary children, but primary children, in that sometimes symbols are given to children. Also, sometimes the teacher can be too directive about what notes to actually make. So it turns out to be, teacher thinking rather than learner thinking. Thinking out loud is a method derived from research. This again makes thinking visible, but it's very intense. So in order to think out loud, I think it can only be done on very short stretches of language, and it requires intense listening on the part of the learners. However, I think this can be merged into current interactional practices rather than being the focus of a lesson itself. But what you notice about all these strategies are that they all involve output. So all involve writing or speaking. The teacher has to talk to demonstrate thinking and language use or explain. So all are based on this idea of making thinking, making language visible. So I just now would draw your attention to what's coming from research, my colleagues' research actually, that might help us think about how to develop metacognitive, metalinguistic, and multilingual awareness. So the first point is additive pedagogies or culturally responsive pedagogies, where we might make use of mother tongue, we might make use of Singlish, thinking about translanguaging, for example. And I'm not talking about using the mother tongue in the English language classroom. I'm talking about using it in service of learning outcomes. So the idea of contrasting languages, the way we say this in one language contrasted with another. For example, in Singlish, the way Singlish does this and the way English does this raises our level of awareness and knowledge about grammar in English. Another thing I'm going to point to is socio-cultural writing from another colleague. And the idea of, I think it was set in a situation of low progress learners focusing on the process of writing with groups and a lot of discussion to develop metalinguistic awareness as one of the outcomes. And then I'll point to another colleague's work in grammar as choice, as opposed to grammar as structure. This is guiding learners to be aware of different choices they have in their writing, which one has what effect. So developing, again, metacognitive and metalinguistic awareness. But again, through use of a meta-discourse. We have to have a language to talk about this. And a few more. In my work, I look at guided pedagogies involving dialogue and assessment for learning. And one that I would highlight, apart from contrastive linguistics, is process discussion. So by the end of a task, to have children discuss together about the thinking, about the language that they use or didn't use, the choices they made, using the meta-language, which is directly applicable to a context, a meaningful context that has just gone beforehand. So it doesn't involve isolating a particular strategy. Another point to consider is setting tasks and problems for group work that are open. So ill-defined problems rather than well-defined. So we're not working on problem, solution. We're working on problem, let's explore. And when we have tasks that are a bit more open, we allow for greater depth and breadth in both thinking and in language. And my final point would come to the teacher's interaction strategies in teaching. The way the teacher listens very carefully, the way the teacher responds to children's questions, queries, struggles, and the response being more explanatory rather than procedural. So taking the emphasis away from doing something to thinking about something. So I'm just going to pause here a little for a moment, just to zoom in on that word, the teacher, because it seems that the teacher is the most important factor in whether metacognition gets taught or not. And I'd like to end by showing you a snippet of a primary 1 lesson with a teacher teaching reading using a big book. She's using meta-discourse to talk about language and thinking, and she's using the grammatical meta-language as well. And as she's going through her reading of the big book, she's developing awareness. So let's just have a look at this. I'll give you a moment just to read the extract. Okay. So the teacher's meta-discourse consists of words like describe, reasons, you must ask yourself. And the meta-language is her use of the term adjective to describe worried. She names children, so she's making others notice the language spoken by that child. So, for example, she names the child who offered the word, another meta-linguistic term, and she states the word worried next to the meta-language adjective. So the proximity of those two words, again, encourages noticing. She names pupils who offer adjectives, and she connects the adjectives through her use of arrows on the whiteboard. But then she also continues to press children. So she challenges them in their thinking. She recognizes that they've reached a platform in thinking, they've got the adjectives, but now they must find out reasons for these emotions. And she says, but from here, right, that's done. Now we think further. From here, you must ask yourself, self-question, Why is the snake worried? What's the issue bothering this baby snake? And she names a pupil to offer an answer. And I think this really shows the teacher's own commitment to teaching thinking and language, metacognition, and the skillful way in which she guides this. This is what she says at interview. She talks about pressing. She talks about challenging. So if I prompt further, I force them to think. But she also talks about careful listening by teacher and pupils. And she also tries to build an environment of security. They have to be comfortable. So she's setting up the discourse norms within her classroom. So I acknowledge that proceduralization and drill and practice are very secure techniques. But in this way, we're seeing a teacher build security explicitly, and therefore being able to be more open and challenging in the way that she teaches meta in English language.